Now we turn our attention to the United States fighting the war. And remember that the United States fought a war on two fronts. Now, Germany fought a war on two fronts, but the two fronts with Germany were much closer connected. The United States fought a war in Europe, and they fought a war in Asia at the same time. Even though the Japanese were the first to attack the United States, we identified Nazi Germany as the existential threat. And so that was our policy, Germany first. But 1942 was not a good year for the Allies in World War II. But then the tide turns, and then we'll see the hinge of fate, and then closing the ring, triumph from tragedy, and the crimes of war. D, E, and F are actually taken from Winston Churchill's great volume epic, The Second World War, and those are sections of each volume taken, so I've taken my liberties with that. Here you see many of the propaganda posters throughout the United States in World War II. Without an internet blogosphere at the time, posters were the way in which we rallied public opinion behind the war and the effort of the war. And you see there an effort to get people to carpool to work rather than drive one car, because that was fuel that could be used for tanks in Europe or in Asia. As I said, the Nazis had it to be dealt with first. But the United States understood that they could not simply open up a second front in Europe right away. The United States Army was not prepared for any major operations until it could be built up and then properly trained. So the idea was to open up a second front in Africa, specifically North Africa. The other aspect of this was to win the Battle of the Atlantic, to keep the supply lines open to Britain and turn Britain into the largest aircraft carrier and supply base in order to prepare for the invasion of Europe. Now, at the outset of the Second World War, you had three powers: the United States, which is the new power of the world; Great Britain, which represents the old colonial power of the world; and then you have the Soviet Union, which represents, of course, the communist world. These three were united in their opposition to Nazi Germany. Hence, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is a very unusual alliance. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all working together to vanquish Nazi Germany. Churchill understood early on that the United States would have to be the senior partner. They were the ones that had the wealth, the manpower, the supply. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was the one that was taking the brunt of the fighting in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And so you had to navigate many different political situations with this alliance. And perhaps the biggest problem, the biggest navigational issue, was the Allied commanders. For Britain, you had Sir Bernard Law Montgomery, known as Monty. Monty is an egotist, a glory hound. He's a very devious individual. He is also absolutely adored by his troops, and he would have to be dealt with. Georgy Zhukov is the commander-in-chief of the Russian forces on the Eastern Front. He was one of the few people that could actually look Stalin in the eye and tell him the truth, whether Stalin liked it or not. And because of this, he was well regarded by his own troops. You also had Charles de Gaulle, the youngest member of the French General Staff, and the only member of the French General Staff who did not surrender. He led the Free French forces, also an egotist, also a big personality. He would often clash with the Allied commanders. You had George S. Patton of the United States, also an egotist, also a glory hound, also someone who was clashing with many of his commanders and fellow commanders. On the other hand, you had Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley was a soldier's soldier, meek, mild-mannered, but with a spine of absolute steel. He was the man who navigated the problems often between Montgomery and Patton and had them work together. Sir Arthur Tedder of Great Britain was in charge of the British Air Force. And all of these individuals, with the exception really of Zhukov, who was on the other side of the front and could not really coordinate too well, all of these individuals were under the command of Dwight David Eisenhower, the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower had not served in World War I. He had actually served back at home as the superintendent of West Point. Eisenhower was not a great tactical general. He was not a great strategic general. He was, however, a general that knew how to get other people to work with each other. He was an incredible administrative genius when it came to this. And most importantly, he was able to make sure that his generals were able to work with each other instead of against each other. And so Eisenhower becomes the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe. The Allied powers were not just the United States, Britain, and Russia. You also had China under the command of Zheng Jieshi, who we also refer to as Chiang Kai-shek, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the nations that had been invaded by Nazi Germany, like Belgium and the Netherlands, many of the nations of South America, like Argentina and Chile, the Swedish nation, the Norwegian nation. Sweden, was neutral. The Greeks were involved in this, and so you see a wide range of nations that have joined the Allied fight against the Nazis. Looking clockwise from the top left, you see General Bernard Law Montgomery, better known as Monte. Top center is Eisenhower. Top right is General George S. Patton, who was one of those strange birds who believed himself to be reincarnated. He was the reincarnation of Marcus Scipio Africanus, the great general of Rome who defeated Carthage during the Carthaginian Wars. On the lower right is General Georgy Zhukov, who when he looked at you, you knew you were being looked at. Bottom center is Omar Bradley, and lower left is General Charles de Gaulle of France, who would later become president of France. The winter of 1942 was a very, very dark period, very similar to the year 1777 when the American Continental Army was at Valley Forge, and Thomas Paine called it the year that tried men's souls. The Philippines, which had been invaded by the Japanese, and MacArthur was ordered off of the Philippines by the president to go to Australia to rally the Allied forces there. The peninsula of Bataan and Corregidor fell, and there the soldiers and sailors were making up caustic hymns of feeling abandoned by the U.S., which could barely do anything to help them or save them at the time. We're the battling bastards of Bataan, no mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. Nobody gives a damn. That was Frank Hewlett, who later would make what was called the Bataan Death March, in which all the American sailors and soldiers who surrendered were forced to march 75 miles in the hot sun of the Philippines, often without water, to a camp where they endured horrific conditions and horrific treatment by the Japanese, who did not regard those who surrendered with any honor according to their Bushido code. The British also lost their great island fortress of Singapore and Hong Kong at the same time. At the Battle of the Java Sea, the Japanese scored a major victory against the British and Allied forces, and now Indonesia was open to invasion in their great oil fields. The Americans lost Wake Island, which was out in the Pacific, and now the Japanese sent 150,000 soldiers to New Guinea. And if New Guinea fell, then the island of Australia would then be next on the list. As if that wasn't bad enough for the nationalist Chinese forces that were fighting the Japanese in China, Japan closed the Burma Road, which was the chief supply route for the supplies that were being sent by the British and the Allies to the Chinese. From this point onward, until they reopened the Burma Road, supplies would have to be flown to China and that meant you had to fly over the Himalayas, which meant that planes, which could barely do 25,000 feet, now had to climb to 30,000 feet because you would run into the Himalayas. But on April the 18th, 1942, a glimmer of hope appeared when Jimmy Doolittle, who you see in the picture to the right, led a raid on Tokyo. The amount of damage that this raid did was insignificant in the overall picture as far as destroying industries and so forth. But it was a huge morale boost for the United States. The USS Hornet sailed to within launching distance of Japan, launched bombers from the aircraft carrier, which was considered to be an impossible feat. They then flew, dropped their bombs over Japan, and then flew to China, where the Chinese gave them aid and got them back to America eventually. The Doolittle raid did more than just boost morale for the United States. It was also a clarion call to the Japanese that they had not defeated the Americans and that they would need another operation, they thought, to finally finish off the Americans in the Pacific. Here you see one of Doolittle's B-17 bombers taking off from the deck of the USS Hornet with its destination of Tokyo. When it took off from the deck, the plane actually dropped below the deck, making people think that the plane was going to crash. But then it got enough power to pull back up, and it was off and on its way. The Japanese had now reached the Hawaiian Islands, the westernmost Hawaiian island of Midway. And we're looking now to make an invasion of the Hawaiian Islands, or maybe even the west coast of the United States. But the United States had broken the Japanese code. A bunch of Navy men working downstairs in the basement, often wearing smoking jackets, painstakingly took apart the Japanese code of hypo, and we were able to read the messages before the Japanese were able to read their own messages. Because of this, we fought the Battle of the Coral Sea off the coast of Australia in 1942. What's significant about the Coral Sea is that for the first time, the two fleets did not come within visual sight of each other for the battle. Instead, it was the aircraft who came within sight of each other. Now, the Coral Sea was largely a draw, but the Battle of Midway between June 3rd and 6th, 1942, was the turning point, when 4 Japanese carriers were sunk: Akagi, Hiryu, Soryu, and Kaga, all sent to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Japanese could simply not replace those losses as quickly as the Americans could, and it was a devastating blow for Japan. And now at this point, the United States goes over to the offensive. The main commanders of the Battle of Midway, from left to right: Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had succeeded Admiral Husband E. Kimmel after Pearl Harbor. Nimitz defended Kimmel and said, in his situation, I probably would have done the same thing. In the center is Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, who took over the Hornet carrier group because Admiral Halsey had a case of the shingles. Spruance had no experience in carrier tactics, and yet he was amazingly good at it. And Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher of the USS Yorktown, which was mortally damaged during the battle and had to be sunk, but Fletcher was the overall tactical commander at Midway. The heroes of Midway, clockwise from the top left, is Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, commander of Torpedo Squadron 8. He was killed at Midway. Ensign George Gay of Torpedo Squadron 8 survived after being shot down and witnessed the entire battle from the water. It was because Torpedo Squadron 8 pulled down the Japanese fighters that were covering the carrier as protection that then Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, who is on the bottom right, led the attack from a group from the USS Enterprise. His decision to fly an extra 10 minutes despite being low on fuel was the difference in spotting the Japanese fleet. Lower left is Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie of the USS Yorktown, who also led the squadron that sunk the carriers of the Japanese. 1942 moved on into the summer and then into the fall. U.S. troops then went ashore on the island of Guadalcanal on August the 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal is located in the southeastern corner of the Solomon Islands, which are the islands that shield Australia. Guadalcanal was part of the campaign to take New Guinea, retake New Guinea, and protect Australia. It had a very long airfield on it called Henderson Field, but Guadalcanal was an absolute terror for both the Japanese and the Americans on there. At one point, a Japanese fleet sank the American fleet that was protecting the Marines, and the Marines were cut off for a time, so the Marines had to essentially go on their own until supplies could come back. New Guinea was a terrible place. The Solomon Islands were even worse at Guadalcanal. Meanwhile, the United States is also coming from the east. The Tarawa campaign begins in 1943. Tarawa is located in an island chain called the Gilbert Islands. This is part of the Great Convergence strategy in which MacArthur would come up from the south and Nimitz would come from the east, and they would converge on the Philippines. The problem with Tarawa is what you see in the picture there. The murderous Japanese fire on the beaches cut down many American sailors. When those pictures reached the United States, there was a huge outcry against the waste of American lives as the American public saw it. Roosevelt had to go back on and give yet another fireside address saying, this is part of war. We lose men in war. However, the Allied commanders realized that to take every single island that the Japanese held on the way to Tokyo would simply cost too much men, material, and most importantly, time. So what they would do is they would bypass heavily protected Japanese islands and leap over them or hop over them. This came to be known as island hopping, in which you would pass over a Japanese stronghold and take another island, and that way you would cut off the Japanese and make them wither on the vine. This map of the Pacific shows the various campaigns of the Japanese and the Americans during World War II. You see the red line that shows the furthest extent of Japanese occupation and strategy. You also see circled the three major battles of late 1942 and early 1943, with Guadalcanal being near the bottom of the map, Midway at the top center, and Tarawa between them. All roads at this point are going to lead toward Tokyo, but first the Philippines and then Japan. World War II was a war of propaganda. And propaganda did two things. It helped the nation win the war, but it also cast the enemy, especially the Japanese, in very racist tones. You will notice there the sinister-looking Japanese, bespectacled, large teeth, and other times they will be depicted as rats and other vermin. In the poster on the upper right, notice that Hitler is merely caricatured, while the Japanese is depicted, again, buck-toothed, bespectacled, very sly looking. Again, this is racism at work in the war. The Japanese also countered with their own propaganda. They depict MacArthur here as a bomber and warmonger who loves to kill and shields himself under the cloak of the United States. Again, notice the racist aspect of propaganda that is directed against the Japanese. It depicts them as monkeys, rats, apes. More benign is the propaganda against the white Germans. You also had Axis propaganda showing Germany smashing Stalin in the east while the self-righteous Britons look on. Radio propaganda was fierce from the Axis, who had three notorious broadcasters, all of whom were Americans. Mildred Gillers and Rita Zucker were the two Axis Sallies, while Eva Tagore was Tokyo Rose. Tagore was an American citizen living in Tokyo and was forced to do this, or her husband was going to meet some very unfortunate circumstances. Tagore was pardoned by President Gerald Ford in 1975 after showing that she broadcasted under duress by the Japanese. As I am sure many of you all discovered in reading Flyboys, there was a certain irony to the Americans' opposition to the Japanese and the Germans and their racist policies. Here you see Nazi Germany showing the Americans as Ku Kluxers with exploiting the Indians and African labor. And notice the Jewish loincloth, of course, as they bomb peaceful Germany. Propaganda. In late 1942, the Allies now move on the offensive against Germany in North Africa with Operation Torch. The leader of the invasion of North Africa was General Mark Clark, yet another larger-than-life personality who knew it. But when the U.S. met the Germans at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the United States was defeated, largely because it was untrained. The Kasserine Pass is right near Tunis, Tunisia, where ancient Carthage is located. It's at this point that Omar Bradley and George S. Patton now begin to reorganize the army and put some discipline to it. On the other side of the North African desert, a major battle was raging for control of the Suez Canal. This was called the Battle of El Alamein, right outside of Alexandria in Egypt. This is where Monty had his major victory over General Rommel, Field Marshal Rommel of the German army. Meanwhile, in Stalingrad, that city was under siege from July 1942 until February of 1943. The German armies had penetrated all the way to the Volga River and were looking to move past Stalingrad and all the way into the Caucasus oil fields, which is where the biggest oil reserves in the world are located. But the Russians held on. At one point, they were pushed to only 300 yards from the river and then pushed back, and then the Russian winter set in. And in the end, the Germans were cut off, and 100,000 Germans had to surrender in the dead of winter. In Casablanca, Morocco, the Allies met for their first major conference. And there you see Churchill and Roosevelt. And notice again that Roosevelt is sitting in a regular chair and sitting because the press still did not take pictures of him in his wheelchair. At the Casablanca conference, the decision was made to invade Sicily and Italy. But in addition to that, when asked about what the goals of the Allies were toward the Axis powers, Roosevelt, without any prompting or without any conferring with his allies, answered that they would accept only unconditional surrender from the Axis. The British, of course, had been looking for a negotiated peace, but the Americans said, no, the Axis need to be trounced and they need to surrender unconditionally. Now, there is a tradition for this because some 80 years earlier, General Ulysses S. Grant demanded the surrender of Fort Donelson from his very good friend, by the way, Simon Bolivar Buckner. And the Confederate general was told that his surrender needed to be immediate and unconditional. And that began the tradition of unconditional surrender in the United States. Now, the British said this is going to lead to a protracted war, to which Roosevelt and the Americans said, then let it be protracted. Nazism needs to be stamped out once and for all. So here are the invasions of Operation Torch in Morocco and in Algeria, around the city of Algiers and Oran and Casablanca. Opposing the Allies on this invasion were French forces from Vichy, France. However, the Vichy forces decided to change sides and join the Allies as the Allies came ashore. This map of Europe during World War II shows circled the areas of the Kasserine Pass, the Battle of El Alamein, and Stalingrad. You can see just how far the Germans had gotten into Russia. And if they had been able to secure Stalingrad, then they could have turned into the Caucasus oil fields, and they would have been able to link up with their forces in the Middle East if they had been able to get past El Alamein. This war was very close on several occasions to turning in a very disastrous direction for the Allies. In the upper left are U.S. soldiers on retreat through the Kasserine Pass. Top center is General Mark Clark. Top right is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, who fought Montgomery in North Africa. Bottom left, and in the center of the photo, is Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who was the commander of the German forces outside of Stalingrad. Paulus was told by Hitler not to surrender, and he was promoted to Field Marshal. The next day, Paulus surrendered anyway. Hitler did not promote anyone to Field Marshal after that. 91,000 Germans went into prisoner of war camps in Siberia after Stalingrad. Only 5,000 would return home. You see here the ruins of Stalingrad after the siege had been lifted in the winter of 1943. The dark streak in the background is the Volga River. Fighting in Stalingrad was literally building to building and room to room. And if you want to see a good movie about the details of the Battle of Stalingrad, then Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law, Joseph Fiennes, Rachel Weisz, Bob Hoskins, and Ed Harris is an excellent movie. It was made in 2001. After Stalingrad, the Russian army now went over to the offensive, just like the U.S. did in the Pacific after Midway. Hitler had this insane policy of not permitting his soldiers to retreat, which meant that they had to stretch their much weaker forces along a much broader front against the much stronger Russians who had the manpower to man these fronts. In 1943, the Allies now met at Tehran, Iran. Iran, which controlled the Persian Gulf, which was a major supply conduit for the Russians during World War II, had originally been on the side of the Axis. But the Allies then engineered the overthrow of their old Shah and put in Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was the last Shah of Iran before the Islamic State took over in 1979. Now, at Tehran, Iran, this is the first meeting of all three of the major powers' leaders. You had Stalin, who was called Uncle Joe by FDR, who felt that he could work with Stalin to a certain degree. And Churchill, who, of course, had no use for Stalin whatsoever, but he was an ally and needed to be respected. Here they discuss the Second Front in Europe, and the Soviets are made to agree to the United Nations, and that the Soviets would eventually enter the war against Japan when the time was right. Now remember, the Russians and the Japanese were not at war at this particular moment. Now the Allies go ahead with the invasions of Sicily and Italy. Churchill called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe. Italy is many things, Mr. Churchill, but he found out it was not soft. They invade the island of Sicily with Operation Husky in July of 1943. They race for the port city of Messina, which is in the upper northeast corner of Sicily, and then launch over to Italy in Operation Avalanche. Here are the two great battles of Anzio and Cassino, which is south of Rome. And then Rome itself falls on June the 4th, 1944. The big three in Tehran, on the left, Stalin, in the center, Roosevelt, again, seated, not in a wheelchair, and Churchill, looking like he'd rather be anywhere other than next to Stalin. Here you see the map of Sicily as the Allied forces went ashore and then begin to race toward the northeast, where you see Sicily and Italy joining for the port of Messina. This is, of course, where the famous incident happened where Patton slapped a soldier who was suffering from post-traumatic stress and was essentially suspended for a time from command because of this. But in many ways, the slapping of that soldier did wonders for the U.S. Army, although it was a terrible thing to do. Don't get me wrong. There's a great scene in the movie Patton where Patton actually races ahead to Messina ahead of the British, and the British come marching in with their bagpipes, and the Americans are already there, and they start playing Stars and Stripes Forever as the British are playing Scotland the Brave on their bagpipes. The slog up the Italian peninsula was very difficult because Italy has the Apennine Mountains, and you see as the Germans fall back stubbornly and stubbornly until the Allies line behind the German lines at Anzio and then are pinned down. There's also the great mountain of Cassino and the town below it until finally they pull back behind Rome, and Rome will be liberated on June the 4th, 1944. The invasion of Italy was but a prelude. 2 days after Rome was declared an open city and was occupied by the Allies, the Allied forces now went ashore in France at Normandy in Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944. Here, the United States invaded at Omaha and Utah beaches. Omaha was an absolute bloodbath, but eventually the U.S. 1st Division, the Big Red One, the U.S. 29th Division, the U.S. 116th Division secured the beach. Meanwhile, at Utah Beach, the American forces under the command of Theodore Roosevelt Jr. landed in the wrong spot and had absolutely no opposition. Roosevelt and his commanders decided, let's go inland from here, let's start the war right here. And they did. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, he died a few days later from a massive heart attack. The British landed at Gold, Sword, and Juno beaches and had moderate opposition, but they were able to move ashore as well. Also helping in this was the British Airborne, the U.S. 82nd Airborne, and the U.S. 101st Airborne that dropped behind the lines and secured towns such as Caen, Saint-Mère-Église, Bayeux, which was William the Conqueror's old capital city. And after this, the U.S. and the British and Canadian forces and Australian and New Zealand forces moved inland. And while we are moving inland during Operation Overlord, the Russians are driving west. The Russians reached the outskirts of Warsaw, at which point the Polish partisans rose up against the Germans. The Germans then brutally defeated the Polish partisans, and then the Russians, who had been waiting outside, then pushed the Germans out of Warsaw. And so on January the 1st, 1945, Warsaw fell, and Warsaw, which was already a devastated city from the bombing in 1935, was now devastated yet again. And now something begins to happen. The Russians begin to establish communist governments in these countries that they are, quote unquote, liberating. This is considered to be the boat that won the World War, called the Higgins Craft, built right here in New Orleans by Andrew Jackson Higgins and Higgins Industries, called Landing Craft Vehicle and Personnel, LCVP. It had the front gangway that dropped down that allowed troops to run off, and also jeeps and sometimes even tanks to come off of it. Andrew Jackson Higgins had been a swamp boat operator who was largely put out of business by the Great Depression, now converted his factory to building these Higgins crafts. This is why we have the World War II Museum in New Orleans, which originally was called the D-Day Museum, because D-Day does not refer simply to the Normandy invasion. It's any day of an invasion is called D-Day. This is the great abbey of Monte Cassino, which was established by Saint Benedict of Nursia. This is the birth of Western monasticism. This monastery was close to 1,400 years old. We mistakenly believe that the Germans were using this as a reference point for their artillery, And so we ordered up a whole bunch of bombers to go ahead and bomb it. This is a result of the bombing, which actually did turn the monastery into a reference position for the German artillery after that. But the U.S., realizing its mistake, later then took as many of the original stones as they could, fashioned new stones, and totally rebuilt the monastery to the way it looks like you saw in the previous slide. In the upper left, you see the beachhead at Anzio in Italy, which Allied forces were pinned down for a time until they could break out. Lower right, you see General Mark Clark leading the Allies into Rome. Rome was declared an open city. It was not fought over, so Rome was preserved. This map of England and Normandy, which is in the north central part of France. Notice where the Allied forces came from in England, and then what was called the Spout to Gold, Juno, Sword, Omaha, and Utah beaches. Here you see a close-up view of Normandy with Gold, Sword, Juno, Omaha, and Utah beaches, where the Americans and what were called the Anzacs and British. Anzacs were Australian, New Zealanders, the Canadians, and the English forces that came ashore as well. Normandy was a very, very difficult terrain because it had these things called hedgerows, which had been built during Roman times. They were 12 feet high, they were very thick, and topped by a hedge. It was very difficult for tanks to navigate through there. This picture shows invading forces of the Americans going ashore at Omaha Beach on a Higgins craft. Omaha Beach was a very difficult landing spot. U.S. forces were pinned down throughout much of this before they were able to break through. What you see here is a medic treating a wounded soldier on Omaha Beach. Of course, the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan is perhaps the most visceral depiction of what happened at Omaha Beach as the 29th Infantry went ashore. In the year 1864, the United States held a presidential election in the midst of its Civil War, which was a major test of the American democratic system. 80 years later, we would do it again, holding the election of 1944 during the World War. Thomas Dewey, a lawyer from New York, now secured the Republican nomination. He ran on a platform against the New Deal and advocating smaller government after the war. And there were some partisan attacks that didn't get too personal, but at times they got a little bit on the vicious side. But that's simple politics. Roosevelt secured the nomination for a fourth term and won a fourth term, despite the fact that Roosevelt by this point was suffering from very high blood pressure, was smoking far too much, was a very ill man. He was only 61 years old. What's significant about this election is that Roosevelt now cast aside his New Deal vice president, Henry Wallace, and put a more moderate Democrat from the center of the nation, Harry S. Truman of Missouri, on the ticket as his running mate. This was called the famous Second Missouri Compromise. This was done to balance the ticket and to appeal to more middle of America voters. It would be a fateful choice because Harry S. Truman will eventually become the president when Roosevelt dies. Eventually, the Allies break out of Normandy and now begin to drive east. Paris is liberated on August 25, 1944. Hitler had declared that Paris should be defended to the last man. However, the commander of Paris, the Nazi commander of Paris, thought the city too beautiful for that and decided to make it an open city. Now the Allies reach Belgium and free Belgium, and now they're on the border of the Netherlands. And this begins one of the greatest operations that fails in World War II, Operation Market Garden. It'll be a massive land and airborne invasion to liberate Holland. This is the brainchild of Montgomery. What they want to do is they want to go all the way to the Rhine River at the town of Arnhem that you see in the upper right-hand corner. Seize the bridges at Eindhoven, at Nijmegen, and at Arnhem on the Rhine River. Then swing into Germany and end the war by 1944. It fails. They reach the outskirts of Arnhem, but the British Airborne Division, it drops down on 2 Nazi panzer divisions and is essentially decimated, and they have to retreat back across the Rhine River to with the 2,000 of the 10,000 soldiers that they went in there with. They were plagued by poor communication, bad radio sets. The Nazis had overrun their landing zones and could not be supplied anymore. This battle is depicted in the movie A Bridge Too Far, which was a major movie in the 1970s, directed by Sir Richard Attenborough, the old man in Jurassic Park. The Germans are now pushed back to the German border, but they have one last attempt at an offensive in their sleeves, and this is the Battle of the Bulge. Between December of 1944 and January of 1945, this will be the biggest battle for the United States since the Battle of Gettysburg. The Germans will put a huge bulge in the Allied lines with the idea that they could drive to the coast, seize the Belgian port of Antwerp, and then negotiate a settlement so that the Germans could then turn against the Russians in the east. But the bulge did not succeed, part of which is that the 101st Airborne Division in the town of Bastogne refused to surrender. This is the famous note that the Allied commander sent to the German commander who had demanded surrender, and he said simply, nuts. And the German commander is, what is nuts? Eventually, the bulge was relieved and Bastogne was freed, and the German tanks ran out of gas because they had not enough fuel. And the Americans pushed further and further into Germany until they come to the Rhine River and cross it at the town of Remagen on the Ludendorff Bridge, March 7th through 8th, 1945. And now the invasion route into Germany is much easier than it had been in France or the Netherlands or in Belgium, because the Germans had built something that allowed the invading forces to go more quickly. The Germans had built autobahns, their interstate highway system. And because of this, the Allied forces were able to move very quickly. The Germans had built the autobahn so that they could move forces back and forth from one front to the other against the Russians or against those in the West. Now we're using it to invade into Germany. The war is nearing its conclusion. In February of 1945, the Allies meet at the Black Sea resort town of Yalta. And there they discuss post-war Europe and call for the unconditional surrender of Germany. They then decide on a plan to divide Germany into military zones and denazify it. That is, remove from power or bring to justice all members of the Nazi Party of high-ranking status or even middle-ranking status. Both Churchill and Roosevelt realized there is not much they can do about Poland. Russian forces have liberated Poland, and Russian forces have installed a communistic puppet government. But the Soviets do agree to enter the war against Japan. And they also agree on a system of war reparations from the Nazis and justice meted out to Nazi war criminals. And they agree on the final details of the establishment of the UN. There is the picture of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin at Yalta, and you can see that 62-year-old Franklin Delano Roosevelt is looking incredibly thin, frail, and dying at this point. Roosevelt will go home after this and deliver a speech to the American people and in a joint session of Congress in which he is seated. And for the very first time, Roosevelt lets on that he has paralysis. He says, "You will excuse me for sitting down for the speech, but it's much easier when I don't have 10 pounds of steel around my legs." It's at that point the American people realized their president was crippled. Essentially, what happens to Poland is that it is shifted further to the west. The red line shows the nation of Poland today. The blue line is the old nation of Poland. And you can see in the bottom right of the picture, you see Lvov, which is now called Lviv, which is one of the major cities in Ukraine to this day. In the upper part of Old Poland, you see Wilno, which is now Vilnius. This is part of Lithuania. The problem for the Allies as they went further and further into Europe is that they were still getting their supplies from Normandy. That red line is the supply line to the Allied forces. And as they get further and further from their supply port, the supply chain needs to be extended further and further. This is called the famous Red Ball Express. Now, the blue arrow that you see at the top right of the picture, that's the invasion route of Operation Market Garden, getting the towns of Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, which does not quite reach its objectives. And then the purple area you see there is the Battle of the Bulge, as the Germans attempted to sweep all the way to the English Channel. And they were using new weapons by this point called buzz bombs. They're V1 and V2 rockets that they were dropping on London that caused a great deal of terror at the time. Here on the map, you can see in the lower center the farthest expanse of the bulge with the town of Bastogne in there. The 101st, the Screaming Eagles, did not give in and held on. And while the Allies are moving closer and closer to Berlin, they're also tightening the vice on Japan. New Guinea and its 150,000 Japanese soldiers was essentially abandoned by the Japanese. It surrendered in 1943, what was left of the Japanese forces there. You had the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, which is right off of the Philippines. This is where what was left of the Japanese fleet was now sent to the bottom of the Gulf, and Japan was now open to invasion. MacArthur returns to the Philippines in October of 1944, declaring, "I have returned." We then capture the Marianas Islands. The Marianas Islands are islands that are close enough so that long-range bombers can now begin to bomb Japan. The islands of Guam, Saipan, and most importantly, Tinian. Tinian had a very long runway in which now the new B-29 super fortresses would be able to take off from Tinian. Now the bombers could use the Marianas, but the fighters had a shorter range, and so you needed islands that were closer to Japan. The island of Iwo Jima is invaded on February the 19th, 1945, my father's second birthday. It would not be liberated until March 17th, 1945. But now you had an island where fighters could go and protect the bombers over Japan. Next comes Okinawa in April of 1945. Okinawa is a long string bean of an island, 350 miles from the Japanese mainland, but it is considered to be part of Japan proper. It is off of Okinawa that we begin to see what we're in for if we decide to invade Japan. The civilians were using improvised explosive devices to blow themselves up, or they threw themselves off of cliffs rather than surrender. And something even worse than that was happening off the coast. As Japanese pilots essentially trained with nothing more than the ability to get the plane up off the ground, then flew their planes into Allied ships. In the year 1300, a A Mongolian fleet was coming for Japan to invade, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a typhoon came and destroyed the Mongolian fleet. The Japanese said that this was a divine wind that came from the gods. The word divine wind in Japanese is translated as kamikaze. These were the infamous kamikazes, and it showed us what we might have to deal with if we invaded Japan proper. We might need to have another solution to invading Japan. So from the bottom of the map toward the top, you had New Guinea, and then you had the Leyte Gulf, and then Iwo Jima on the right and Okinawa on the left, as we're getting closer and closer toward Japan. On the left, you see the famous Battle of the Leyte Gulf, which left the Philippines open to invasion by the Allies. On the right, you see the Marianas Islands, which is alongside the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest part of the ocean. My close friend and mentor, who was my scoutmaster, was a veteran of the War in the Pacific, U.S. Marines. He went ashore at Iwo Jima. But he was training on how to get his pack off in the water once he entered the water. And when he got off the side of the ship, he noticed that there were boats circling with men with rifles in there. And he said, "What are those men there for?" And he said, he was told, "Well, that's because of the sharks that might be coming." He said he never got his pack off more quickly and back into the boat after he jumped in the water in his entire life. The bottom of the map, you see the island of Guam, and then further north you go towards Saipan and Tinian. Here you see MacArthur walking ashore at Leyte Island at the Philippines. Notice the Higgins boat in the background. Notice the diminutive Filipino behind MacArthur. That is President Manuel Quezon of the Philippines. When they were getting out, Quezon told MacArthur, "I hope the water's not too deep, because then the people will find out I can't swim." MacArthur said, "Well, that's okay. When I step out into the water, people are going to realize that I can't actually walk on water." This is typical MacArthur, a staged event, if ever there was one. Called an upside-down pork chop, the island of Iwo Jima provided airfields from which fighters could take off to protect the bombers going over Japan. It is dominated in the southwest by the volcano known as Mount Suribachi. Iwo Jima was a relatively new island covered by volcanic ash and had no vegetation on it. It had no water on it. The Japanese that were there were not on the island so much as in the island, because in a volcanic island like that, it is honeycombed with caves in which the Japanese excavated tunnels to link them up. If you ever see the movie Flags of Our Fathers and then Letters from Iwo Jima, you get to see what Iwo Jima was really all about. My scoutmaster, my friend, who I mentioned in the previous slide, he went ashore at Iwo Jima and sunk up to his waist in the volcanic ash, which is coarser than sand, but it's almost like quicksand to a certain degree. This is the photograph that finished off the war in the Pacific for the Americans. The raising of the flag at Iwo Jima was not at the end of the climax of the battle. It was actually early in the battle. The soldiers secured Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag on it, at which point all the ships began to blow their horns and the soldiers began to cheer. And a Marine colonel said, "I want that flag for my office." Well, the Marines who raised it said, "Hell no, this is going into the regimental museum," and they immediately pulled down the flag, and the photographer was not able to see this in time to take the picture. And so he asked that they raise another flag. And so these 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman, whom you see in the picture here, would make the famous iconic raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. Top left is Franklin Sussley. Top right is Michael Strank. Center left is Harlan Block. Harlan Block is the one who is crouched down planting the flag into the ground. Susli, Strank, and Bloch all would be killed before the Battle of Iwo Jima was over. Center right is Rene Gagnon. Bottom left is Ira Hayes, who you see at the far right of the picture with his hand now no longer touching the pole. And at the bottom right is John Bradley, a U.S. Navy corpsman who is actually behind the Marines that are lifting the flag. It is Bradley who would later leave the memoirs and stories that his son James would turn into the book Flags of Our Fathers, which later became a motion picture that was produced and directed by Clint Eastwood. Harlan Bloch, the one who was planting the flag into the ground, was misidentified as another soldier. But when the picture got home to the United States, Bloch's mother said, "That's my son, that's Harlan." To which his father said, how can you know that? She says, "I changed the diaper on that rear end for the first 2 years of his life. I know a rear end when I see it." And sure enough, she was right. Gagnon, Hayes, and Bradley were all brought home to stump for war bonds and reenact the raising of the flag. But Hayes had serious survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress and developed a serious drinking problem and was eventually shipped back to the Pacific to finish out the war there. But it was this picture that supplied the bond drive or motivated the bond drive that helped raise enough money to bring the war to an end, because by this point the U.S. had gone broke and needed to borrow more from the American people. Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima today. The island has been returned to the possession of Japan. There are still tour groups that go out there, but they need to have special dispensation. Nobody can simply just fly. They have to go with specific groups. The grass covers all. Pile the bodies high at Austerlitz and Waterloo. Shovel them under and let me work. I am the grass. I cover all. And pile them high at Gettysburg, and pile them high at Ypres and Verdun. Shovel them under and let me work. 2 years, 10 years. And passengers ask the conductor, "What place is this? Where are we now?" I am the grass. Let me work. Carl Sandburg. The war would come to an end in triumph, but it would also come to an end in tragedy. In Europe, U.S. and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River, had photo ops together, danced around together, drank vodka and whiskey together, but it was largely for show. Both sides began to look at each other as more enemy than friend. The Soviets were given the job of taking Berlin, which made many people in America upset. But Eisenhower said the southwestern portion of Germany, the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr, the Saar regions, and so forth, those are far more important strategically for the Allies, and so the U.S. would allow the Soviets to take Berlin. Unfortunately for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he did not live to see that day. On April the 12th, 1945, he was in Warm Springs, Georgia, to rest and recuperate. He sat for a portrait that remained unfinished. That night, he said, "I have a terrific headache," and died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was in the presence of one of his mistresses, not his wife Eleanor. On that same evening, Harry S. Truman became the President of the United States. He was walking through the rotunda of the Capitol, having just finished a poker game with his old friends in the U.S. Senate. Immediately, the Secret Service came running toward him and said, "Come with us, Mr. President." He said, "I'm the Vice President." They said, "No, come with us, Mr. President." And Truman said, "I don't know if you've ever felt a whole load of hay dump on you, but that's how I feel right now." He gets to the White House, and there is Eleanor Roosevelt, looking very sad. And Truman goes to Mrs. Roosevelt and he says, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything that we can do for you?" And Eleanor Roosevelt looked at him sadly and said, "No, Mr. President. Is there anything we can do for you?" From his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler declared that the death of Roosevelt would be the deliverance of Germany. He could not be further wrong. In early April of 1945, Mussolini, who had been removed from power after the Allies invaded Italy and then was put in prison, was rescued by the Axis and flown to northern Italy, where he was reinstalled as a puppet dictator. But now partisans in Italy captured him and lined him and his mistress against the wall and shot them and then hung them upside down in a gas station in Milan, Italy. Hitler was under no such illusions that this could happen to him, and as the Russians were approaching, he married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. The next day, April 30th, 1945, he and Eva took a cyanide pill, and Hitler then finished the job by shooting himself in the mouth. The death of Hitler did not mean the end of the war. The war continued on until Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was the successor to Hitler as the leader of Nazi Germany, authorized all forces to lay down their arms and surrender. On May the 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day commenced with the signing of the Nazi surrender in Holland, of all places. As the Americans were going through Nazi Germany and their invasion, they now began to see Hitler's final solution at work as they liberated concentration camps like Belsen, Dachau. The Soviets liberated Auschwitz. This was the true terror of the Nazis, the extermination of 9 million people, 6 million Jews, 3 million Roma, who we used to call gypsies, homosexuals, mentally ill. Europe in the post-war days was a continent that was filled with refugees. The roads were filled with civilians running especially away from the invading Russian armies. As we well know, Russian armies can be a little bit brutal. The War Refugee Board was headed up by Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury, the only Jew that was in the cabinet, who looked at Germany and said that Germany needed to be liquidated as a nation and broken up back into its old Holy Roman Empire districts. Here you see the Soviets putting the flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. In typical Soviet communistic fashion, the picture wasn't good enough, so they photoshopped some smoke over the top of it to give it more of a dramatic air. It was actually a very clear day when they did this. It wasn't cloudy, it wasn't smoky or anything like that. But the communists need to propagandize things, and so they dramatized it a little bit. One part of the war was now over with, but the Japanese continued to fight on, almost insanely, not realizing that they had been defeated. The Allies now drew up plans for the invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. It had two sub-operations to it: Operation Olympic, which was the invasion of the southern Japanese island, and then Operation Coronet, which was the invasion of the main island of Honshu. When the figures were tabulated, it was projected that the United States would lose close to 1 million men in the invasion of Japan, including all 6 Marine divisions. This was considered to be an unacceptable risk, and something else needed to be found to counteract the Japanese will to fight on. This project was called the Manhattan Project, which was the construction of the atomic bomb. Led by J. Robert Oppenheimer in the upper right, he was the scientific director. In charge of logistics and security was General Leslie Groves in the lower right. Much of the experimentation went on in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then finally the first bomb was set off in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Prior to this, Chicago scientists had set off a nuclear chain reaction underneath the stadium of the University of Chicago. They did not know what they were doing all that well, and could have easily blown up the entire city of Chicago when they did it. But they controlled the reaction and then moved it to Oak Ridge and then to Alamogordo, and then they were ready to send the bomb overseas to be used on Japan. We would drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The first would be on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, codenamed Little Boy. The pilot of the B-29 Superfortress to take off from the island of Tinian is the man you see in the picture right there, Colonel Paul Tibbets. I actually had the honor of shaking his hand. He named his plane the Enola Gay after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets. When the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, it caused 100,000 casualties. 3 days later, we dropped a bomb on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. This caused only 60,000 casualties because Nagasaki is located in a sheltered valley which controlled much of the bomb's blast. So only 60,000 were killed. Of course, you know the irony of all this is that the firebombing of Japan actually caused more casualties than the atomic bombing of Japan. But the effect was felt, and the Japanese, especially the emperor, realized that the game was up and it was time to surrender. This is Hiroshima right after the bomb was dropped. If you go to Hiroshima today, it is a beautiful, sparkling, Japanese style of city. Lots of high-rise buildings, lots of beautiful areas, but they still maintain the Peace Park to commemorate those who died. And Ground Zero, by the way, is just in an alleyway between 2 of the high-rise buildings. This is the naval cruiser that delivered the atomic bomb, Little Boy, to the island of Tinian. This was the USS Indianapolis. After it delivered the bomb, it then went straight to the Philippines, or on its way to the Philippines. It was sunk by a Japanese submarine that put 2 torpedoes in its side. Of the 1,195 crewmen aboard, approximately 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 890 soldiers and sailors faced exposure, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and shark attacks, while stranded in the open ocean with few lifeboats and almost no food or water. The Navy only learned of the sinking 4 days later, when survivors were spotted by the crew of a PV-1 Ventura on a routine patrol. Only 316 of those men survived the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. It was the greatest single loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the U.S. Navy. And the story of it is well told in the movie Jaws by Quint, the captain of the boat that is hunting the shark, who was a member of the crew of the USS Indianapolis. Despite the Japanese military's insistence to fight on to the last man, the emperor managed to get a surrender notice out to the Allies and a message to the Japanese people to bear the unbearable and accept defeat. August 14, 1945 was declared Victory in Japan Day, VJ Day. Just like with VA Day, people went out into the streets to celebrate Times Square, New York, Grant Park in Chicago, Canal Street in New Orleans. The official surrender of the Japanese was on the USS Missouri, September the 6th, 1945. 92 years earlier, Commodore Matthew Perry had sailed into Tokyo Bay to open Japan to the west. His flag from his flagship was on board the USS Missouri when this happened. It was over. The war was done. The signing of the surrender ceremony was set up with great pomp by Douglas MacArthur, who you see on the left side of the photograph. Standing next to MacArthur is General Bull Halsey. Signing the document accepting the surrender for the Allies is Admiral Chester Nimitz. Accepting the official surrender from Japan was General Jonathan Wainwright, who was one of the survivors on Bataan, and Sir John Percival, who was the British survivor of the fall of Singapore. With the war over, it was now time to prosecute those who had caused the war. For the Nazis in Germany, the Nuremberg war trials took place from November the 21st, 1945 until October the 1st, 1946. This was all the product of Robert H. Jackson, a Supreme Court justice, whom you see in the upper right, who would take on the role of chief prosecutor during these trials. There would be American, French, British, and Soviet judges. Francis Biddle, a former attorney general, would serve as the American judge. Now, this was tricky because, after all, the Nazis, many of them said, if we had won, we probably would be doing the exact same thing to you all. 22 Nazis were put on trial. The most prominent of them was Hermann Göring, who was Hitler's deputy Führer in charge of the Luftwaffe. He had risen to more than 300 pounds and was heavily addicted to drugs, but then he was put in prison, put on a 1,500 calorie a day diet, and he was weaned off of his drugs, and suddenly his mind cleared. He became quite a formidable witness on the stand, who fenced intellectual swords with Jackson from time to time. Rudolf Hess, who was the mentally ill toady of Hitler, who had parachuted into Scotland in 1941, trying to work out a peace deal between England and Nazi Germany. He should not have been put on trial, even though he was a Nazi to the core. He had not done anything criminal, per se. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect. He built all the great buildings using Jewish slave labor to do this. Wilhelm Keitel was the general in charge of the German forces in the West that surrendered. Alfred Jodl was Hitler's close military advisor. And Joachim Ribbentrop was the German foreign minister who had signed the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, a fact that he always seemed to be able to remind the judges, which made the Soviets feel rather uncomfortable from time to time. Göring was sentenced to death by hanging, but he had made friends with one of the American guards who brought him his luggage so that he could spend his last night in his silk pajamas. The American guard didn't realize that inside his silk pajamas was a cyanide capsule that Göring took and killed himself. Hess was sentenced to life in prison at Spandau Prison in Berlin. He spent the rest of his life goose-stepping and Nazi saluting in his cell until in 1995 he finally hung himself with electrical cord. Albert Speer did 20 years in prison, was released, and then wrote a book called Inside the Third Reich. Many people said that Speer was given too light a sentence. Keitel was sentenced to death by hanging. Jodl, death by hanging. Ribbentrop, death by hanging. For the Japanese, their court would be the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The big three that were put on trial here was Tomoko Yamashita, who was the Tiger of Malaya. You see him in the center. He is the one that forced the surrender of Singapore. Masahiro Hama on the far left, he is the one that conquered the Philippines. And of course, Hideki Tojo on the right, who was the military prime minister of Japan. These men were sentenced to death for what was called command responsibility, that they themselves did not actually kill anybody, but soldiers under their command killed people. Keep that in mind when you think about the Russians and what's been going on with them. These are the Nazi prisoners in the dock at Nuremberg. And the front left of the dock is Hermann Göring, sitting next to a standing American guard. He had lost a lot of weight. Rudolf Hess has his head bowed. When asked to plead guilty or not guilty, he simply stood up and yelled, "Nein." You'll notice that some of these gentlemen, such as they are, wear sunglasses in the court because many of them had been addicted to drugs. The light was a little too bright for them. They were allowed to wear their military uniforms, but they were not allowed to wear any military insignia on their uniforms. Here are the Japanese defendants with Tojo on the far left. The exposure of the final solution was a heartbreaking thing to watch and see what a cultured nation like Germany could do to these individuals and starve them out and put them into concentration camps, execute them, put them into gas chambers, and so forth. It did happen. The next photograph is very visceral, so I advise that you take it carefully. These are bodies that had been destroyed by the Nazis, placed into trenches. The rage that many of the soldiers liberating the concentration camps felt was something that many of them never got over. The Nazis put together special killing squads called Einsatzgruppen, police battalions that would go about and round up Jews and other undesirables and kill them or herd them into train cars and send them to concentration camps. And here you get to see where massacres took place. European Jewry was almost completely decimated. The Japanese war crimes were also horrific. In the upper left, you see Yasuno Chikao executing an Australian POW named Leonard Siflete for an escape attempt. This soldier, by the way, that executes Siflete was a Christian and did this under duress. If he did not execute this man, then he himself would have been executed. But Chikao was later found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to be shot by firing squad. In the lower right, you see the Bataan Death March. Many of the Japanese guards that were on the Japan Death March were Korean, because Korea was under Japan's control. The Koreans were very badly treated by the Japanese, and the Koreans then turned and treated the Americans very badly as well. Filipino prisoners of war, forced to bow as Japanese officers came by. And if they did not bow, you were slapped, and if you didn't bow a second time, they cut your head off. These are American POWs being liberated from their POW camps in Manchuria and throughout the Philippines and other places where the Japanese maintained POW camps. You get to see just how malnourished they were. Here are soldiers of the 101st Airborne under the command of Major Dick Winters, liberating the Eagle's Nest of Hitler and Berchtesgaden in the German Alps. When it was mentioned that the 101st might be sent to Japan to help finish off the war, there was a riot on the train, which was, again, one of the many reasons why we chose to find another solution to invading Japan. Many of the soldiers felt that they had done their job in Europe and did not need to be transferred over to help the Marines or the Army that was over there already. These are Marines that are walking through the mud of the island of Guadalcanal. The canal was a horrific place, as it was called by the Marines. This is, of course, where one of the most famous Marines served, General Lewis Puller, Sr., better known as Chesty Puller, who was the most decorated Marine of them all. Here you have a whole line of Rosie the Riveters working on a locomotive. Once again, women working and doing the jobs that men did and doing it just as well and just as competently leads to many changes in the outlook that women had regarding their abilities and what historians call their agency. War correspondents were integral to bringing the news home to the people of the United States. On the left is Ernie Pyle, who went everywhere and seemed to interview every soldier, asking them where they were from, letting people know what the little guy was up to. Pyle was very fond of one particular unit in Italy, but he went everywhere. He was killed in Okinawa by a Japanese sniper. On the right is Bill Malden. Bill Malden ran a comic strip called Up Front, featuring two worn-out veterans called Willie and Joe. It was a favorite of the troops. Patton hated it. That's why the troops loved it. Two other war correspondents. On the left is Walter Cronkite, who later would be the anchor of the CBS Evening News for more than 25 years, always finishing with his signature, and that's the way it is. On the right is William L. Shirer, who was an American correspondent living in Paris at the time the Germans came marching in. He wrote two major books, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and The Collapse of the French Third Republic. Any soldier who has lived in the conditions of combat, constantly hungry, cold or hot, miserable conditions, the continued exposure to death, the constant worry about death, the constant worry about your fellow soldiers and dying will lead to what is known as post-traumatic stress. Originally called soldier's heart, and then shell shock, later battle fatigue, now called post-traumatic stress. One of the symptoms of it is the 1,000-yard stare. And one of the best quotes about the 1,000-yard stare comes not from a movie about World War II, but a movie about Vietnam called Full Metal Jacket. The 1,000-yard stare. A Marine gets it after he's been in the shit for too long. It's like you've really seen beyond. I got it. All field Marines got it. You'll have it too. Bill Malden's famous cartoon Up Front featuring Willie and Joe. You see them sitting in a very wet morass of a swamp. Joe, yesterday you saved my life and I swore I'd pay you back. Here's my last pair of dry socks. Notice, if you will, the look of tiredness on their faces, the unshaven aspect. These are soldiers that have been worn down by combat. Here's another one, capitalizing on soldiers' gallows humor. I need a couple of guys who don't owe me no money for a little routine patrol. One major aspect of officer and enlisted men's relationship was called chicken shit. Chicken shit was any sort of behavior by an officer that was designed to enforce the subordinate status of infantrymen. It could be petty things like this is officer's country, stay out, or putting your infantrymen in danger so that you can get a unit citation or a medal or something like that. And here you see Joe and Willie being told they're not allowed to go into the officers only area after they've been on long patrol, and there you see a spit and polish officer probably never seen a shot fired in anger. Malden even managed to find a little chaplain humor here, as the chaplain is leading a prayer service and yelling, "Hey men, now hit the deck." This was how the average ordinary soldiers saw the war. This is not the war from Eisenhower's perspective, but from the perspective of Willie and Joe. The war changed everything for the United States. The United States was no longer an isolated nation. It was now a world superpower.